The great hall should have swallowed her whole. She was not a woman who entered rooms. She occupied the minimum possible portion of them, took the edge of the bench rather than the center, stood near the column rather than before the fire. 22 years of practice had made it nearly instinct. Compress, be still, be gone before you are remembered. But the great hall of Aldebrand's hold did not accommodate anonymity. It was 40 feet of torchlight and old stone and the accumulated weight of 7 sworn provinces, and every surface carried the banners of the houses that had knelt here. She walked to the center of it, and the rushes whispered under her feet, and 200 eyes turned toward her, and she thought, with the specific clarity of genuine panic, she should not have been here. She was Wren, just Wren, a name like a bird, and a name her mother had chosen for its smallness, its naturalness, its resistance to questions. A herbalist's apprentice from the river provinces, no sworn house, no family title, no parchment that named her anything except a woman of reasonable skill with cold climate plants. That was the version of herself she had carried carefully for 15 years, like something breakable in the bottom of a pack. The summons had come in the king's cipher. You did not refuse a king's cipher. She had braided her dark, auburn hair back from her face and borrowed a high-neck travelling dress of midnight blue wool from the way station's lending chest, and she had walked into this hall looking precisely like what she needed to be. A river province woman who had come because the law required it and expected to be dismissed by morning. She wore no jewelry. She carried nothing. She kept her hands still at her sides. She was not dismissed. Aldebrand the Grey, Alpha King of the northern reaches and sovereign of 7 sworn provinces, sat at the high end of the hall, in a chair that was not quite a throne, and held more authority than any throne she had ever imagined. He was not what she had pictured from the edicts. He was younger than his title and older than his face, somewhere in the mid-range of his 30s, and the grey that threaded his dark hair at the temples had come early in the way of men who carry very large weights. The scar that ran across the back of his left hand, knuckle to wrist, was silver-smooth with age, and he wore it the way he wore his title, without commentary. His eyes, when they found her among the 40 women assembled in that hall, were the colour of a river in winter. They found her immediately. That was the thing she could not stop returning to. In a hall with 40 women, his gaze moved through the assembly and stopped. Not swept past and returned. Stopped. On her specifically, with the quality of attention that is not curiosity, but recognition. What the court saw when the steward called her name and she walked forward was a woman who moved with the deliberate stillness of someone who had decided what their outside should look like. She was tall, her dark auburn hair braided simply back from a face that was too defined for comfort. A wide mouth, a strong jaw, amber hazel eyes that caught the torchlight and did not look away from it. She was not dressed for beauty, and it did not help. She understood what the claiming was. The Alpha King's formal selection of a mate was not a modern invention. It was as old as the provinces, older, a blood right witnessed by the full court and sealed by oath. But it was not only political. The court scholars were clear about this. An Alpha King of pure bloodline could recognize his mate in the old way, through something in the marrow that was not sentiment, but instinct. A pull that preceded choice, that named a woman before the mind had framed a question. The court called it the mate recognition. The scholars called it the binding sight. She had heard of it, the way one hears of things that happen to other people. His steward called her name. She walked the length of the hall. She stopped at the prescribed mark in the stone floor and looked up. He had not looked away. He asked nothing. He simply looked at her with those grey winter eyes for a long, complete moment, and she looked back and held herself still and breathed. and there was something happening in the air between them that she was not prepared for and could not name. Then he spoke 3 words to his steward, who made a mark on the parchment. She had been selected. The women around her murmured. She turned and walked back to her position, and she thought about the mark on her collarbone, pressed flat beneath the high wool of her borrowed dress. And she thought about what it meant that the alpha king of the northern reaches had chosen a woman of no house and no history. And she thought about how afraid she was, and how she could not under any circumstances allow that to show. He was still watching her. She could feel it. She remembered the exact moment she had learned what she was. Not the label, the real fact of it, the weight of it. She had been 7 years old. The river outside their holding had run grey for 11 days, killing the fish, and the village elders gathered in the market square as they gathered for things too heavy for private houses to hold. She had been small enough to sit on the low stone wall without being visible, her feet bare on the rough, worked granite, and she remembered the texture of it. The specific grain of riverstone, under her bare heel, cold and honest. Because it was the last morning she spent not knowing. Her mother found her there. She sat beside her without speaking, which was her mother's way, and after a long time she reached up and opened the collar of her linen shift and showed Wren the mark on her own collarbone. 2 interlocking lines, old as the hills, carved into the skin at birth by the midwives of a house that no longer existed officially. A house declared extinct by royal decree 23 years prior. A house that a king had needed to be extinct. She pressed her daughter's small hand flat against the mark and said, "Hide yours the same way I hide mine. High collars, low answers. Give them your first name and nothing else." Wren had not asked why for another 2 years, by which time her mother was dead. Fever, midwinter, and there was no one left to ask. A neighbour woman named Alditha had taken her in without explanation and taught her to grow things in cold ground and to keep her collar buttoned and to answer questions only as far as the question required. She had spent 15 years being Wren, just Wren. She was not simply Wren, which was the problem. The mark on her collarbone was the problem. The grey river and the failed milk and the winters that had no intention of ending were the problem. All of it pointed back to the same fact, which was that she was the last of a bloodline that someone powerful had needed to erase, and that she had survived this by becoming nobody in particular, and that being nobody had worked perfectly well until a king's cipher arrived at the door of her modest holding and required her presence in his hall within a fortnight. She had spent the 3 days of travel calculating how long she could maintain nobody. She thought about this as she was led to the East Tower chambers, assigned to women under consideration, and she set her pack on the narrow bed and sat beside it in the torch-lit quiet, and she pressed 2 fingers to the mark on her collarbone through the wool of her dress. She had a habit of doing this in moments of particular uncertainty. Not for comfort, exactly, but because the mark had always been cold and solid and had no opinions, and she found this useful. It was warm, not body warm, something else, something directional, like a compass held near north. She frowned and pressed harder, and the warmth pressed back, and she thought, this is the cold, the exhaustion, the shock of a very long 3 days. She thought it was none of those things. She unpacked her travelling kit. A comb, her small scissors, the dried sprig of thyme she always kept at the bottom of her pack, as a habit so old she had forgotten why she started. And she arranged these on the window ledge, in the order she always arranged them, because routine was also armour, and she went to the water basin and looked at herself in the small polished brass mirror above it. She looked frightened. She rearranged her face into the version she wore in public and buttoned her collar to the throat. What she did not account for, sitting in that East Tower room, while the mark on her collarbone ran warm and strange, was that someone was already watching her, had already been watching her, if she had known how to read the grey winter eyes, had in fact been waiting for her, specifically. They were the patience that had outlasted 2 years of searching, and 40 women assembled in a torchlit hall. The hold breathed around her, old stones, old air, old bones. She pressed the mark one more time and told it to be still. It did not obey. Court had its own grammar, and Wren was fluent in the grammar of being overlooked. She moved through the common rooms with the particular economy of someone who has learned that smallness and stillness are forms of armor, not shy, not cold, simply neutral in the way of a stone in a stream. She smiled when she was spoken to and answered in short, complete sentences and offered nothing that could be taken as invitation. The other women moved around her with the careful wariness of people who have been collected for the same purpose and are deciding what to feel about that. She let them decide. And one of them, a dark-eyed woman from the eastern provinces named Ines, found the whole arrangement genuinely amusing and said so within the first morning. Wren liked her immediately and was careful to like her only a small amount, the kind of liking that costs nothing when left behind. Lady Hawass was not a woman under consideration. She was Aldebrand's cousin through his mother's line, and the master of his household in everything except the formal title. And she moved through the hold the way rivers move through landscape, always arriving where she intended, always cutting the shape she chose. She was elegant in the cold, precise way of women who learned elegance as utility before they learned it as pleasure. Her voice was quiet. Her eyes were softer. Both of these were the most frightening things about her. She came to find Wren on the third morning, in the common room where Wren sat near the window with needlework. She was not particularly working. The approach was casual enough that Wren's shoulders tightened immediately. Howie sat across from her in the way that was not a display of power and was absolutely a display of power. And she asked pleasant questions in a pleasant voice, and Wren answered each one at exactly the length the question required, no more, and watched the lady's soft eyes for information. She asked where Wren had come from. Wren told her. She asked who had trained her as an herbalist. Wren told her that too. She asked, after a small pause, whether Wren's mother had been an herbalist as well. Wren set her needle down without appearing to and said, in the even tone of someone reporting weather, but that her mother had passed when she was young, and she did not know much of her history. Lady Hawass said that was very sad. She said it the way one closes a document. The conversation ended. She moved away. And Wren sat with the certainty that the exchange had told someone, something she had not meant to give. She began to watch Lady Hawass the way she watched all difficult things. From a distance, without appearing to, she noted whom the lady spoke to after leaving the common room. She noted the angle of her head during formal meals. She noted that Lady Hawass watched the king in the way people watch things they have a claim on, even when the claim is unstated. She also noted that the king did not watch Lady Hawass, not inattentively, actively. He redirected his gaze away from her with the deliberateness of a man who had completed his assessment of something and moved on. The formal assessments happened in the great hall over the first week. When her turn came, she walked to the center and stopped and looked up and found him, watching her before she was fully in the room. He asked what she found most difficult to cultivate in cold climates. She told him. He asked whether things that grew in difficult soil tended to have stronger roots than things grown in easy ground. She looked at him. He looked back. She said she believed that was generally true. He nodded once, and she returned to her seat with the certainty that they had just had a conversation about something neither of them had named. She found the treatise on the 5th morning, I standing in the castle library, with cold grey light coming through the single north-facing window and the smell of dust and beeswax, and something older underneath both. She had been running her fingers along the lower shelves, when the pull in her mark turned specific. She stopped her hand, looked at the third cabinet from the left. She found it there, parchment on wood boards, old enough that the ink had faded to brown. The librarian was not present. She laid it flat on the reading table and stood over it in the cold light and read, and what assembled itself in her had the particular cold clarity of things she had already known in her body before her mind caught up with the words. The Valdres blood, her blood, carried the land sight, the capacity to perceive the kingdom's health not as a concept, but as a physical fact. To feel the old blood curse in the marrow, the way the land itself felt it, the grey river, the failing winters, the slow starvation of soil. She had not been sensitive. She had not been fanciful. She had been accurate. The old blood curse had been sleeping for 3 generations, held at bay by the proximity of both royal bloodlines sharing the same territory. When the Valdres house was scattered and officially extinguished, the curse had woken gradually. The court scholars' journals recorded this carefully: crop failures, extended winters, rivers running grey in summer. The treatise said the curse could only be permanently ended by the willing union of both bloodlines, Alpha blood and Valdres blood, bound in the old rite witnessed by the court, not by proximity, by willing bond. She set the parchment down very carefully. The library was very still. The cold came through the window in the particular way of northern cold that does not announce itself, but simply accumulates. And she stood in it and thought about her mother pressing her hand flat against the collarbone and saying, "Hide it," and thought about Alditha, teaching her which plants needed deep roots and which ones needed moving, and thought about 15 years of moving every time someone asked one question, too many. She had known what she was. She had not known what she could do. She had not known what she was worth to a king who needed to end a curse that was killing his kingdom. The question was whether he knew. She thought about 9 years of a failing kingdom. She thought about a man patient enough to spend 2 years searching for something. She thought about grey winter eyes that had found her in a hall full of 40 women and not moved. She stopped believing it was chance somewhere between the difficult soil question and the way he had looked at her when she walked forward in the hall. Lady Hawise answered the question 5 days later, in her particular way. She called a formal lineage review, a procedural verification written into the assessment charter, unused in 30 years, her right as household master. Every woman under consideration would be asked, before the assembled court, to formally state her house lineage and sworn loyalty. The stated intent was administrative. Wren knew, when the summons came, what it was. She stood in the great hall for the second time. The other women were assembled. The court was assembled. A Lady Hawise stood to the right of the steward's table, with her hands folded and her face composed, and her soft eyes doing what soft eyes do when they are calculating rather than seeing. Names were called, houses stated, lineages recited. The court listened, with the careful interest of people watching something that was not about the stated thing. Wren's name was called. She walked to the front. She stood at the prescribed mark. She looked past the steward to the high table where the king sat. He was already watching her. The steward asked for her house name and lineage. The hall was quiet. She said, "I have no sworn house. I am Wren of the river provinces, and I have no lineage I can name publicly." The room breathed in. Lady Hawise looked at the king. Everyone looked at the king. But he sat at the high table with his hands flat on its surface, and he looked at Wren for one long, unhurried moment, and then he looked at his steward, and he said, in a voice that did not raise itself at all, that the review was concluded. Lady Hawise said his name. Once. A question and a protest in 2 syllables. He looked at her. He did not answer. He returned his attention to the parchment before him. The review was concluded. The hall emptied around her in the way halls empty when something has happened that everyone will discuss in other rooms. She stood at the prescribed mark a moment longer than she needed to, and then turned and walked out with the steadiness of someone who has decided what their outside should look like regardless of what their inside is doing. She made it to the east corridor before the steadiness cost too much to sustain, and she stopped with her back to the cold stone and her hands pressed flat against it, and the specific sensation of a trap that had just opened and released her without explanation. He had stopped it. He had been sitting at that table with 200 people watching, and Lady Hawise had set her mechanism in motion, and he had ended it in 4 words without explaining himself to anyone. Lady Hawise had household authority. What he had done was a declaration, and everyone in the room had understood it as one, and he had been looking at Wren when he made it. She stood in the corridor and breathed until her hands steadied. Then she walked to the chapel, because it was the oldest part of the hold, and she needed somewhere that had no function except to be still. The chapel was quiet and low lit by 2 guttering candles, and she entered and crossed to the far wall and pressed her palm against the oldest stones, and the mark on her collarbone ran immediately warm. And she recognized, before she heard the door, that she was not alone. He was in the doorway. He did not look surprised to find her there. The candlelight made him look less formal. Some quality of him settling that she had not seen in daylight, and he crossed to stand near the far wall with the unhurried movement of a man in his own space. He said she had handled herself well. She said she had not answered the question. He said no, she had not needed to. She asked why he had ended the review. He was quiet for a moment, with the precision of someone choosing words rather than gathering them. He said because the review was not a procedural safeguard. It was a targeted instrument, and he did not permit targeted instruments to operate in his hall. She considered this. She asked whether he intended to ask the question himself. He said he already knew the answer. The candles guttered. Somewhere beyond the chapel wall, the wind moved through the hold stone passages. She stood with her palm against the old stones, and he stood with his arms at his sides, and the distance between them was small in the narrow chapel and felt considerable. He said she could show him if she wanted. He said it without reaching, a simple statement. She looked at him for a moment. She reached up and opened the top closure of her collar and pulled the fabric down to show the mark. 2 rivers, interlocking, on the collarbone. She did not explain it. He looked at it, in the candlelight, with the expression of a man seeing something real that he had until now only read about, and the expression told her more than anything he had said. He reached out, stopped short. He looked at her. She did not move. He withdrew his hand. He took 1 deliberate step back. She understood the step. She buttoned her collar. He said she should get some sleep. She left. In the corridor, she pressed both hands flat against the wall and breathed, and the mark was warmer than it had ever been and did not diminish with distance. And she thought about the step he had taken back, deliberate, for her sake, and not his own. And she thought that she was running out of things to tell herself about what was happening. She thought about Lady Hawise, saying his name in that hall, the 2 syllables of it, carrying everything she believed she was entitled to, and the way he had not answered her, not with rudeness, with something quieter and more complete than rudeness, with the particular absence of response that meant the claim had already been assessed and set aside. Hawise understood power. What Hawise did not appear to understand was that the power she believed she was owed had been redirected in the hall today, clearly and publicly, toward a woman with no house and no name. That was not something that could be taken back. She pressed her hands against the wall a moment longer. Then she walked to her room and she did not sleep. And she lay in the dark, thinking about what it would mean to stop pretending she was nobody in particular. He sent for her on the 14th morning, not through the steward, not through the formal channels that had been running their polite course around her, while the real conversation ran beneath. A page arrived with a parchment that bore no seal, private, unwitnessed. A request to attend the estate council room at the top of the keep. She went. The council room was a long oak table, high-backed chairs, a window that looked north across the outer wall to the forest and the grey winter sky beyond. A fire burned in the grate. He was at the window when she entered, and he turned, and he asked her to close the door. She closed it. He remained standing. She stood near the table and looked at him across 12 feet of firelit space, and she thought, here it is. She had spent 14 days deciding what she would do. When this moment came, she had built 17 separate versions of it. Rational, controlled, ending with her exiting the situation with her life and her composure, and whatever remained of the careful small self she had constructed over 22 years. He said her name. Then he said, "I know who you are." She held very still. She kept her breathing even. She asked what he believed he knew. He moved from the window to the table and set both hands flat on the oak and looked at her across it with the full weight of his attention. Not unkind, not gentle, simply present, which was more difficult than either. He said, "The Valdres bloodline, the last surviving heir." The old royal house his father's decree had declared extinct. He said it without drama, without accusation, the way truth is named when you have been carrying it long enough to have made your peace with it. She said nothing. He said, he had known before she was summoned. He had spent 2 years searching. She was not an accident of the assessment process. She asked why he had not simply sent men to take her. He said, "Because the willing bond cannot be forced, not the old rite, not the kind that ends curses." She heard this. She processed it. She said evenly that she appreciated his honesty about his reasons. He said those were not all of his reasons. The fire cracked. The forest sat grey and still beyond the window. She stood on her side of the oak table, and he stood on his. And the distance between them was not large. She asked him to explain. He said he had spent 9 years watching his kingdom thin under the curse, 2 years searching for her specifically. He had read every text the estate library held on the Valdres blood, and the land site, and the blood right requirements. By the time his people found her in the river provinces, he knew more about what she was than she did herself. He said she was not simply a solution. He needed her to understand that. She heard the thing beneath the words. She let it sit in the air between them. She asked what she was, then, if not simply a solution. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone choosing precisely. He said she was the only person he had placed in his hall, in 11 years of ruling, who had looked at him like she was calculating the risk of him. Not the benefit, not the title, not the position, the risk. He said this had been... He paused, clarifying. She sat down. He moved around the edge of the table and took the chair beside her, not across, beside, and said quietly that he did not need her to have resolved everything. He only needed her to stop hiding from him specifically. She looked at the fire. Her hands lay on the table in front of her, and the mark was steady and warm, and pulling not east now, but simply settled, present, as though it had arrived where it had been going. She asked how long he had known she was his fated mate. He said, since she walked into his hall. She sat with that for a long moment. The fire burned down through one log and caught the next. She said she had been hiding since she was 7 years old, So she said the mark had been pressed flat under high collars for 15 years, and she did not know how to be what it meant. She was not frightened of him specifically. She was frightened of what stopped being possible. Once she stopped being Wren of the river provinces, no history, no name. He sat beside her without touching her and said quietly that none of those things were required to change today. He was a patient man. He had been patient for 2 years of searching and 11 days of watching and 14 days of waiting. She looked at him. He looked back. She said she needed to be certain it was her own choice, and not simply what her blood demanded. He said, yes, that was the only version of it he wanted. She did not sleep. As she lay on the stone-cold mattress of her East Tower room, and the mark was steady and warm, and the hold breathed around her with its old patient stones. And she thought through everything she knew, and everything she had decided, and everything she had not yet decided, until the grey light of early morning showed at the narrow window. She thought about her mother. The open collar in the pre-dawn light by the grey river, the 2 rivers joining in the mark on the skin. The way her mother had not explained, had only asked her to hide it, had loved her without preparing her for what the hiding would eventually cost. She thought about Alditha's hands and the smell of rosemary drying in the rafters, and the careful, quiet scaffolding of a life built out of other people's willingness to keep a secret for a child who could not keep it herself. Yeah, she thought about what she wanted. This was the part that stopped her. She had spent so long organizing herself around what was safe and what was possible that she had almost forgotten to have preferences. Almost. The almost was what she kept finding in the dark. The pull in her mark, east, constant. The question about plants that grow in difficult soil. The step he had taken back in the chapel, deliberate, for her sake, and not his own. At some point in the early morning hours, she accepted that she knew what she was going to do. She rose before the hold woke. She braided her hair back in the simple way she always wore it, and buttoned her collar, and walked through the quiet corridors to the door of the estate council room, and knocked on it before she lost the nerve of the early morning. He answered it, which meant he had not been sleeping either. He stepped back to let her in. The fire had been built up. He offered her watered wine from the cup on the oak table, and she took it, and they stood near the window with the grey winter dawn coming in across the forest. And she said she had some conditions. He looked at her. She said she would stay. She would enter the old bond willingly, because she was choosing to, and not because the blood required it, and not because she had run out of other options. She needed him to understand the difference. He said he understood. She said she was not going to perform this. She was not going to become a court version of herself, quiet at the right times, and visible at the right times, and agreeable on demand. She was aware this was potentially inconvenient for a man who had a court to manage. He said he did not need her to be convenient. She looked at him over the cup. The morning light was coming stronger now, the flat, pale silver of a clear winter day, and in that light he looked like a man who had also not slept, and had also come to a conclusion, and the parallel quality of it made something ease in her chest. She said she needed him to say, once, plainly, that it was not only the bond and the cure, and the blood right. She needed to hear him say that she was not the title, not the solution, the specific person. He set down his own cup. He looked at her with the river-grey eyes that had found her in a hall full of 40 women and not moved from her since. He said, yes, she was. He said it quietly, the way he said all important things, without reaching for it, simply, as a fact. She set down her cup. Yea, he reached out and offered his scarred left hand, palm up, the way he had in the chapel. Not taking, offering. The scar silvered smooth in the morning light, knuckle to wrist, old as his authority, and older than her in his life. She looked at it for a moment. She placed her hand in his. The mark on her collarbone ran warm and did not stop, and she felt through the join of their hands something she could only describe later as a settling. The way a structure feels when the final stone is placed, not dramatic, not sudden, only the quiet certainty of a thing that is now correctly assembled. Through the north window, the grey winter sky was lightening at its edge to a thin line of cold gold. The forest held its silence. The hold breathed around them with the long patience of stones that have waited for things before, because she did not know yet what she would become. She stopped pretending she had no interest in finding out.